create an if statement, and then we'll set the inner HTML. We use backticks so we can write out HTML. Again, close them. And then, yeah, as you can see, they're changing now. I haven't done it for the other ones because there's no need. So this video is a continuation from my Cisco MegaMenu tutorial. So if you haven't seen that video, then head over to the description to watch it first before you continue with this video. In this video, however, we will implement GraphQL with our MegaMenu. This will allow us to send queries to find pieces of data that we want. GraphQL will then respond to our queries and fetch the data from a Mongo database. Once we have received our requested data, we will then be able to render this data as HTML elements onto the navbar. So as you can see here, we're going to click the MegaMenu, and then it opens up all of this data, which then finds the specified data that we requested in our queries from a Mongo database. And then once we have received the data, it's then rendered it onto the MegaMenu. Now, when we change our selection, it will then send a new query, and because of that, new data will be returned, which is relevant to our selection. Same with exams. But if you would rather use a RESTful API to achieve similar results, then head over and watch my continuation tutorial of the Amazon sidebar that I created. The link to that will be posted in the description. Keep in mind that GraphQL is simply an alternative to RESTful APIs. I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. They're both perfectly valid methods to achieve the same end goal, just different means of going about it. So we start this video in the root of the Cisco MegaMenu project folder, which we left completed from the last tutorial. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to initialize Node Package Manager so we can do the server-side scripting and set up GraphQL. So we'll open up a terminal window in the root project folder, and we'll say Node Package Manager, init, and then Y flag to say yes for everything. Then we'll open up VS Code or any of its equivalents, but in this case I'm using VS Code, so I'll say code space full stop. Then we create a new file which will be our server. Then we create a new file which will be our server file, so we'll say new file server.js. Inside this we'll need to initialize Express on our app from Express, so we'll need to install Express before we can even do this. So we'll say Express, and whilst we're at it we'll also install Express hyphen GraphQL and just standard GraphQL. Once those three dependencies are installed, we can go back to our server and we'll require Express, and we'll say const Express require Express. Below this we can initialize the app. We'll say const app equals Express, and then we can open up the local server by saying app.listen port 3000, which is the standard. And then we'll say or process.env.port. We don't really need to do the second part, but it's a good practice. There are some things on the app that we'll need to configure. So below where we initialize the app, we will say app.use express.json. This will allow us to handle HTTP post requests which contain JSON data, which is the data that we're going to be using. And we'll also say app.use express.url encoded extended true. Again, this is for the HTTP requests so that they work properly. Below that we will say declare a static folder, so we know what we're doing. We'll declare our yet to be created static folder, so we'll say app.use express.static open parentheses public, which will be the name of the folder. So we'll create that folder in our root directory. We'll say, call it public, as I just said. We'll move all of our files, so the index, script and style, we'll move it all into there. Obviously we won't move our server into there though, because this is our backend content. We'll just move all our front-end content into the folder, which is those three files. Index.html should be the name of the HTML file. This will mean that it gets rendered automatically to the client when they access any unhandled route on our server. This is what we want in this instance. Now it's time to set up GraphQL. So go back to where we required our dependencies. We'll create a new comment. Require GraphQL, it will say. And then we will require a named import from express-GraphQL. And then we will say require, just so we can make the code snippets a lot easier, auto detection. Express-GraphQL, and then we will require a named import, which is GraphQL HTTP. As you can see, the auto recommendation is a lot easier now. Whilst we're at it, we'll also require everything else that we need from just a standard GraphQL dependency. So that will be, so I make sure that we require it first, so it's easy auto completion. There you go, GraphQL like that. We'll go back to the curly braces. We'll say GraphQL HTTP. In addition, put it on a new line like that so it's easier. GraphQL object type, so we can initialize GraphQL object, and GraphQL string, and GraphQL list, because we will be storing strings and lists in our Mongo database, as you will see later on. And actually, whilst we're at it, we're going to install Mongoose, because I don't think we installed that before. So we'll install it right now. Once it's installed, we should require it. So below our require GraphQL comment, we'll say const mongoose equals require mongoose. We'll use that later on. Now below our static folder, we will create a new comment. We'll say GraphQL port, and we'll create a new route, and we'll handle a route with the endpoint GraphQL. So we'll say GraphQL like that. Second argument will be the GraphQL HTTP object, and that will take in an object. And we'll say graphical and set that to be true. This will help us in the development stage because it gives us a UI to interact with and make our queries on. But before we can interact with the user interface, we'll need to create a GraphQL schema. So above where we've written the port comment, we'll say GraphQL schema, so we know what we're doing. Const schema, that will be a new GraphQL schema. That's just going to be blank for now because we'll set up that later after we've set up our database content. So now we can add that schema into the GraphQL HTTP object. We call it schema, so we'll just write it out like that. Now we need to start our local server to see the GraphQL user interface. We'll say nodemon server.js, and obviously in the relevant directory. Okay, I made a mistake here where I accidentally required this same GraphQL HTTP request object twice. So we'll just remove that. So when we restart our server, just remove any errors by entering in RS, and then we go to localhost, and then GraphQL, because that's the route that we're handling. We should be able to see this UI. Query route type must be provided is the error message. This is because we haven't actually created any GraphQL query objects yet. The reason being is because I haven't actually set up the database, so I'll do that now. So above all the GraphQL content, but below where I've declared static folder, I'll create a new comment. I'll say set up mongoose. Below that we'll say mongoose.connect, mongodb, no spaces, hyphen, / localhost. The port by default is 27017, and then we'll call the database name, we'll say Cisco DB. Now we'll need to remove the deprecation warnings. Currently the way to do that is saying use unified topology, set that to true, and also set use new URL parser, set those to true. This might change depending on when you're watching this video, so you need to check that out independently. Below this we will set up the schema, so we'll say const Cisco schema equals mongoose.schema with a capital S, that's very important. We'll overwrite the default ID field, which Mongoose automatically creates for us, but we'll overwrite it with a string value. It will also have two additional fields, which represent the two columns of the third column of the mega menu. If this sounds foreign to you, then please go back and watch my first video. We'll say col1, it'll be type array, and col2, again type array. Below this we can create the model. We'll call it Cisco MegaMenu data equals mongoose.model, no capital this time. item, which Mongoose will transcribe into items with a lowercase I automatically for us, and its model will be the one that we just created, so Cisco schema. Now that we've created the collection, we need to add some data into that collection. So I'll be getting the data from the official Cisco website as reference. I've got a screenshot of the data that appears when the user selects the certifications row. These are the columns and rows that appear, and I'll show you how to lay this out in relation to the schema that we've created. So we'll say const Cisco data equals new Cisco MegaMenu data, obviously our model. Its ID will be a string, obviously, and it will be certifications because that's the name of the row that the user select on to make this data appear. Make sure it's very important that this is the correct spelling because it needs to match up later on. So col1 will be an array as specified. The col1 here just has one sort of section here, but col2 has two sections, as you can see. So col1 of this will currently just be an array with one document, but col2 will be an array with two documents. So col1 will say title, and that will be all caps certifications. As you can see, that's where I got it from. Below that we'll say body, and this will be an array which will contain all of these. So starting with entry and going down to partner. So I'll fill that out now. I'm just going to fast forward. Okay, now that we've filled out all the rows, as you can see, we can move on to the col2 field. So we'll create a comma at the end of the array. We'll say col2, create a new array. This one will have two objects now. So the title for the first object will be most popular in all caps, as you can see on the Cisco website screenshot. The body of this will be, again, an array. Everything from all the rows between CCNA to CyberOps Associate. Now that we've done this, we can create the second section, which starts with the title of I need to. So we'll create that document here. Title, as I said before, I need to ellipsis, whoops. And then the body, again, that will be all the rows between get certified to find certification support. Okay, now that we've filled out all the data, we can minimize this, open this up. We need to close down our NodeMan server just so we don't risk creating a duplicate. Okay, now to save the data, we'll need to open up two terminals. The first one will be Mongoose, which is the local server for Mongo database. The second one will be Mongo, which is the actual Mongo terminal. Okay, once we've opened up these two things, we can restart our NodeMan server, just so we can save the document into the collection. So we'll say NodeMan server.js. Now we will check, before we close down the server again, we'll check to see if it's been saved. So we'll say show DBS. Cisco database has been created, so we'll say use Cisco DB to go inside the database. We'll say show collection so we can see the collection name. db.items, as said before, fine. And as you can see, it has been created, which is good, so we can close this down now. Because if we don't, then we risk saving this again, which will be a duplicate with the same key, which will cause an error. So we'll just delete this now because we've saved it. Now that we've formatted our database, we can go back to our GraphQL schema and we can begin to fill out the query field. This will link to a GraphQL object that will handle all of our queries. So we will call it root query type. This will be the root query. Above where we created the GraphQL schema, we will create a new comment to separate things out. And we will say GraphQL main. Below that, we will initialize the root query type. So we'll say const root query type equals new GraphQL object type, because it is a GraphQL object. Its name will just be query. Again, this name field isn't really that important. The most important one would be the fields property. This name and description field are simply for the GraphQL GUI. we'll say root query type will be description. The fields, again, this is the important one. Fields will be a callback to make sure that all the fields have been initialized before this field property is activated. It will return an object as specified by the parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we'll put an object because this is what we want to return. First field will be col1, and this will return all the col1 data of a specific document. So we'll open it up like that using curly braces. Its type will be GraphQL list. We have to use a new keyword on that, and it will be a list of row type. Row type is a GraphQL object which we have yet to create. We'll create it later. We'll say description rows from col1. We'll give the col1 field the args property. They have one argument of ID. This ID will be a type GraphQL string. Now to the side of the args property, we will create the resolve property. Again, very important. It will take in two arguments. The first one will be parent. We won't use that. We just want access to the args, which is always the second argument. Open it up. It will return a promise. The reason being is because it can take some time to query our Mongo database. So we want to return the results on the database only when the database query is finished, because otherwise it will return null if we don't use a promise. So we'll say return new promise. The promise will take a callback function. Callback function of the argument resolve, which is a default promise method that returns a promise object in itself. The second argument will be reject, which rejects out of the promise with an error message. Open it up, and we'll say we'll use our model to find. We will find the document with matching ID. So we'll say ID as the args ID of the col1 field. The second argument will be callback function with the arguments which will be the error message if there is one, and data, which will be the retrieved document. We'll say if there is an error, then we will reject out of the promise with the error message contained in the object. Else, so if there's no error, we will console.log the data object. Now, for some reason, when we query data from Mongo database using GraphQL, the document retrieved is in an array, even though the array will only have one iteration, and that will just contain the normal document content. So we'll just get access to the first iteration of the array, which will contain all of the relevant data. From that, we can simply get access to the col1 field by saying col1. Now this is merely so we can see in the terminal, but we need to actually return the relevant data in the resolve method up here. So we'll say we will use the resolve method of the promise callback function, and we will return the same data, the col1 data. Once we've done this, we need to create the row type GraphQL query object, because col1 is a list of them. So above the root query type, we will initialize it. So we'll say const row type equals new GraphQL object type, same as before. Again, we'll just say name row. Again, these aren't really that important, just mainly for the GraphQL GUI. Description, individual row, we'll say. Fields, again, same as before, callback function. Whoops, let me start the parentheses because it needs to return the object. Parentheses are how you do multi-line return statements and narrow function. Its fields will be title and body. The reason being is because col1 is the equivalent of col1 in the database, which is an array. It's the reason why we use GraphQL list. It's a list of row type, so we want row type to be the equivalent of the individual objects contained in the col1 and col2 arrays. Now these objects contained in the col1 and col2 arrays had two fields, title and body, so we want to match them in GraphQL. So the first field will be title. Its type will be the same as it is in the GraphQL equivalent of what it is in the Mongo database, and that's a string. So we'll say GraphQL string. We don't need to use the resolve method on this because it will automatically match, because the field names match between the results fetched from the Mongo database and the GraphQL object type. So the next field will be body. Again, the same name as the field. Again, the same name as the field in the Mongo database. Again, I'm going to start a colon there. It's the reason why I'm getting a syntax error. Its type will be new GraphQL list. And same as how it is in the Mongo database, it's a list of strings. So we'll say GraphQL string like that. Now that we've created this, we should be able to test out our GraphQL query using the UI of our local server. So we'll say nodemon server.js to start up the local server again, and then we'll go to the GraphQL root on the local server, which is right here. We'll just refresh it so it works, and we will say we'll open up a query like that. We don't need to use the query keyword because it uses it by default, and then we'll say col1, and we will get the title and we'll get the body, so everything. Now we used the ID argument to find a specific document, so I'll pass it into the query. We'll say ID, we'll find the only document that we've added into our database thus far, which is certifications, so certifications, and then this will match with the certifications document through its ID of our Mongo database. So we will run this, and as you can see, it's returned the col1 field of the first column of the document with ID of certifications in a Mongo database. If you want access to the col2 field of the document, then we need to create a field in our root GraphQL object. So below where we created the col1 field, we'll create the col2 field, which will follow a very similar format. In fact, we'll just copy its entire contents because it's a lot easier. Its type will be exactly the same. The only thing that we will change is I will move the console log. And actually I'll move it here because we don't really need it, because we know that it's working now. We will just say col2, and we'll change the description as well, col2. Now we can save, restart our local server, and then we'll refresh this, and we should be able to get col2 instead. Yep, as you can see, it's working correctly. Okay, so now that we know everything's working, we can go to our HTML document because we've set up the backend now, it's working good. The changes that we need to make are, first of all, actually, we need to go to our JavaScript file, and we will need to remove all of the content inside of this second column event handler function. So we need to remove all of this stuff, which renders the elements. And then we will need to get access to the ID of the event target, which is the element that triggered the event handler. So we'll create a new comment, separate things out. We'll say let col type equals event target.id. The reason why we're getting access to the ID is because this will determine what document we are querying from GraphQL. So we'll need to change the ID attribute of these paragraph elements to match the IDs on the GraphQL. So because we haven't actually created the content for when the user clicks on the training row in our database, we're just going to remove the training paragraphs ID because we don't need that anymore. And we'll remove the ID of the other ones as well, so remove all these. Actually, no, we won't remove certifications, but we'll remove all the other ones, like so. Certifications will keep its ID, but that will be certifications. So the matching ID of the ID of our Mongo database. This is essential for it to work. And we'll also separate out this section using a comment, just so everything's a lot clearer. So we'll say start of second col, and then at the end we'll say end of second col. Now back in our JavaScript file, we will call a function, but only if col type has an ID. So at the moment, the only element that's handled by this change second col event handler, which has an ID, is this one which contains certifications text. So we'll go back and then we will say if col type, we will call a function, load new third col, which hasn't been created yet, and it'll pass in the ID, which in the certifications paragraph will be certifications. As you can see here, that's the ID name. So this function will at the moment only be called when the user clicks on the certifications paragraph. That's the only one with the ID. Oh yeah, this comment which we forgot to write in will say GraphQL. Read the comment description. Below this will actually create this load new third column function. It's going to be an async function because we need to use the await keyword. So async, there you go. Function. That's the column name, as we always said. It will take in the call type, so we'll call it argument have the same name. Inside, we're going to assign the data retrieved from GraphQL to two variables. The way that we do this is we'll say, at the moment, we'll say const call one data, and then we'll say await get call data. This is a function which we need to create, and then we'll say we'll pass in the call type, which will be category, because that's the only one that this function can be called on at the moment. Its second argument will be a string which says call1, and we'll do the same thing for we'll say call2 data equals await, same function, get call data, again hasn't been created yet. Call type will be the same, the only thing that's different will be its second argument will be call2. So below this we'll need to create the get call data function, so we'll say function get call data, it will take in the data type, which will be category in this case, and the call type, and then we'll say return query fetch. This query fetch function again hasn't been created, but what we will do is its first argument will be a GraphQL query as a string. Its first argument will be a GraphQL query as a string. So we're going to go to our GraphQL user interface. So its first argument will be a GraphQL query as a string. So we will go to our GraphQL user interface and we will create a query where the user can pass in the ID value as a variable. So we will create a function, we'll say query, and we'll call it get call data. It will have a variable, use the $sign in GraphQL to create a variable, we'll call it type. Will be type string, and then instead of certifications we will simply say use the variable type. Now to initialize the variable in the GraphQL user interface, we go here and then we say the name of the variable is type, so we'll say that in a string. Its value in this case will be certifications. So now this should achieve the same result. We'll just say yep, as you can see it's working. We're receiving the same data, so I'll just copy this. This will be the query with one slight modification. So this is right. What we need to change though is this call2, because we can either be getting call1 or call2. This is based on the call type argument, so we'll just add that in there using tag template literals, $, open, closing curly braces, and then we can say call type like that. That's good now. And now the second argument will handle the query variables, so it will be an object. Type is the first argument, and then data type, which will be certifications. So this will now be assigned to the ID of type, which will specify which document from the Mongo database we collect back. And this field type, this is just a built-in field that we need to use for GraphQL query variables. That's the reason. See, this is all well and good, but we need to actually create the query fetch function, which will use a fetch request to our local server, which is using GraphQL. So we'll go down, we'll say create a comment, make the initial request to GraphQL. Function query fetch is the name, because again that's the name there, we want to obviously match it. Query, its first argument we will say query, again in this case it will be the string. Second argument will be this object here, which contains the query variables, so we'll say variables, we'll say return the contents of this fetch request, so we'll say fetch, go to our GraphQL root of our local server, which is obviously GraphQL, that's the one that we set it up on. And then we'll say method, it will be post, because we need to post the query along with the variables to GraphQL. Headers, this isn't necessary, but it's just good practice to write this out so we know that we're sending JSON data. So content type will be application/JSON, and then we'll say body. This will contain the data of our post request. JSON.stringify. be a JavaScript object, which will be converted to JSON. Query will be the query string, which obviously an argument, and then variables. We have variables. Again, these two fields are built into GraphQL. They need to have these specific names for it to work properly. On this fetch method, because it returns a promise, we will activate some code when the promise returns a value. We'll use that using the then method. Response, we will pass response from JSON into just a normal JavaScript object. So we'll do that, we'll say response.json, use the JSON method. Now it will be passed into a JavaScript object. Now the response will be passed back into a JavaScript object from JSON. Now we can go back to our getCallData function. Because query fetch returns a promise, which means that this response where it's actually passed is also a promise in itself, we can use the then method on this query fetch function. So we can say then we'll call the response data and we will return data. Now GraphQL actually bundles the data into its own object which creates, and it's got the field of data which contains the data that we get back here. As you can see, they've got it here. So we'll say return data, and then we need to access our data. Now as you can see, GraphQL automatically creates this data field which contains the documents from our Mongo database. So we need to tap into this field here by saying data. And then from that, we will access the call type field. So this will either return call1 or call2, depending on what we passed into call type. Again, call1, call2 assigns two different variables. Now once we got the data related to our certifications row, we need to find a way to actually render the data onto the MegaMenu as HTML elements. So below all of this, we will create a new function to make things clear. The comment, we'll create a new comment just to make things clear what we're doing. We'll say render third call. Below will be a function called render call data. I have two arguments, call data and call type. And then inside we will initialize a new block scope variable called call string. It will be an empty string. If call type equals to 1. This will initialize call string to be the beginning third nav call div without the inline styling. So if you remember, for the second row column, we added this margin top inline styling just to push it down a bit. We don't want this if it's for the first call, so we will just copy this here, this opening div for the third nav call, and then we'll say else. So obviously it's not call type 1, so it must be call type 2. We are going to initialize call string to have that inline styling. So we'll copy it from there, just paste it in like this. Below this, we will loop through, because remember the values of call1 and call2 were both arrays. So we'll loop through them. We'll say call data dot for each, bearing in mind that call data will receive these two variables here in return, and then we'll say row will be the individual objects which are the iterators of the array. We will append, so we'll say call string plus equals, use backticks, and we'll get this header div. Again, we copy it from here just so it's the correct formatting. We will delete training and we will get the title from the row object. So we'll say row.title. Remember that there was two fields of the call array and they were title and body. Remember that body contained an array of strings. So we need to loop through the array contained in the body field so we can render them out as paragraph elements. So we'll say row.body.for each. We'll say option, the individual strings. As the individual strings, we'll open that up, and then we'll say call string, we'll append new values. So plus equals to do that, and then we'll just copy this paragraph element just for brevity, and then we'll say replace that, we use tag template literals, it's a lot easier. Just the value of option, the individual strings. Now outside of the parent for each loop, we'll close it off like that. We will say call string, we'll append a closing div, which will be related to this opening third nav call. We need to close it off now, and then we will just return this, which will soon be appended into our HTML document object model. So we'll go back up to our load new third call function. We'll create a new comment, separate things out because things are getting pretty heavy now. I'm going to say clear out third call to make room for new data, and then I'm going to create a reference to the third more nav divider, which I'll show you in a second. Third more nav equals document.get element by ID. We will call it third more nav. I'll show you what this is a reference to. It's a reference to this. This contains all of the content for our third column of the mega menu. We will set its inner HTML to be just an empty string, so you want to clear out its contents that I might have had from the previous selection. So we'll say third more nav equals, whoops, actually no, we need to say inner HTML to clear out its inner HTML, obviously. And now we're going to initialize the string content related to the first and second columns. So we will say, okay, a new comment, we'll say render new data. Let col1 string equals render col data, that function that we just created. We'll pass in col1 data and we'll say 1. So we can render out that column without the margin top. Below this we'll say if col2 data. The reason being is because we only want to initialize col2 string if col2 data contains content. If you go back to the Cisco website, this selection here, there is no actual column 2 content. So sometimes there might not actually be column 2 content. And if we try to call this function on an empty array, it will return an error because it needs to loop through the arrays. And obviously there's no content to loop through, then it will cause an error. So we'll say var, because we're initializing it in if statement and we want access to it outside, we use var. So it won't have block scope. Col2 string equals render col data. Inside that we'll pass in the col2 data and also 2, so now we can render out the column with the margin top padding. And then below all of this we will say third more nav dot inner HTML equals col1 string plus col2 string. So this will append a bow string to the third nav, which is the third column of the mega menu. Now we could save this, and now we can test things out. So we'll just restart our NodeMon server. We'll go back to our localhost. What we will do is we'll just go to the default route, so get rid of the GraphQL user interface. I'll go to more. As you can see, this is just our normal dummy content, but if we click on certifications, then it should change the data received from the Mongo database. Yep, as you can see, there's a bit of a pause because it is what it's doing. It is sending asynchronous requests. But we click on that and it is working. Obviously, when we click on this, it's set to not send the query to GraphQL. This is because it's just a tutorial. We're not going to fill out all the content because otherwise this video would be way too long. But as you can see, I've given you the tools that you need to do on your own now. If you're wondering how to replace this dummy content on initial website load, then we can simply, outside of all these functions, we can just write a new comment. We will say load data for third column on initial load, and then we will use the load new third col function. So that make more sense if it's below the change first col function actually, sorry. Now remember that all change second col function does is well, first of all it sorts out the styling, but below that all it does is it gets the ID of the element that triggered the event handler, and then it passes that into the load new third col. So all we're going to do, we'll say, well, we can only use certifications because that's the only document that we've added to our database, because otherwise the video would be too long if we added in more. So we'll just load new third col certifications, and now when we load our website, it should automatically be loaded up with the mega menu certifications options. So we can go back, click on refresh, open up this. And yeah, as you can see, it's already displaying the data. Now obviously, if you were doing this for real, you'd fill out the mega menu data related to the training option, and then that would be automatically loaded up, but we haven't added that to the database. So, you know, obviously when we click on certifications now, the data's already loaded up, so it won't change. But you can do all that yourself. This is now the end of the tutorial. If you had any questions, then please post them in the comments box below and I'll be obliged to answer them to the best of my ability. Also, if you want me to clarify on a certain topic because you didn't understand things, or maybe my explanations was a bit short, then please post them in the comments box below and I will try and clear up any problems that you might have. It's the least I can do. And also, can you please like and subscribe? If you did enjoy this video, you would do me a huge favour if you did that. And yes, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was beneficial, and peace out.